Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us.
Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm Holly, and I am the co-host around here, and I'm happy that you are joining us today. Do you find that you run to food to comfort you when you're feeling sad, angry, or upset? Do you suffer from debilitating negative self-talk around body image? Have you asked God to free you from your dependency on food and you feel like He's just not listening? If you identify with any of these things, let me first say you are not alone. And in today's interview, we hope to shed some light and encouragement in this area. Today, Esther and I are chatting with Dr. Rhona Epstein. She is a psychologist, speaker, and author who mainly deals with overcoming food issues and finding freedom. Dr. Rhona shares her own story with food addiction and how she overcame it with the power of Christ in getting help from others. You'll hear Dr. Rhona talk about how we discern a real problem from a bad habit, the importance of separating food and our emotions, and how the only way to heal is understanding our dependence on God. We also discuss whether food addiction is real, the different approaches to healing food addiction, and ways we can support those we love who are struggling. Lastly, we tackled Dr. Rhona's thoughts on the body positivity movement, negative self-talk, and what the church can do in this area of struggle for so many. Food addiction is something we haven't talked about yet on the podcast. And if you've listened for a while, you know that we are not afraid to dive into touchy subjects. We hope this conversation sheds light on a taboo topic that the church is often afraid to deal with, as well as provide hope and a path to freedom for those of you who can relate to this topic. But before we get into this interview, I want to share with you our sponsor for this episode. Today's sponsor is Esther's amazing Uplift Mentor Mind for Christian women. This is a program designed exclusively for Christian women who are in the testing or established phases of business and who are ready to thrive, streamline their marketing, and hit their financial goals. Most of the members of Uplift come in when they have started to create consistent revenue, but they want to really get their business to a place of thriving, or they are loving the work they're doing and they're able to have marketing strategy that fits their current needs. I can tell you firsthand as a member of Uplift that this program is pivotal in my business growth. Not only do I get to be a part of amazing Christian business owners, but I get to learn from Esther and other experts about ways that I can transform my business into something that is God honoring. So the doors are going to be opening to this program this month. So be sure to head over to upliftmentormind.com and apply today. Now let's get on to our conversation with Dr. Rhona.
Well, welcome, Dr. Rhona, to the podcast. We are super glad to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, great. To get us started, would you be willing just to share a little bit about what your life and leadership looks like right now and kind of what you do in your work?
Well, I am a psychologist and a speaker and author. So mainly I spend most of my day with people, just one-on-one. Mainly that's what I do all day, every day, all week. But I have some books that are on my favorite subject, which is helping people to overcome overeating. And I do some speaking on that. And I have some online programs that I try to help people with that as well. So that's pretty much what I do.
Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your leadership journey and maybe when you realized you were a leader?
Well, I think I was probably I don't know that I was actually made for leadership. I don't think that's really my thing. I don't think I was a person who wanted to be a leader, to be honest. I was probably a person who had a heart for what I do so that I could help people. And I realized that if I wanted to make an impact, that I need to become one. And so I had to find some confidence and strength and skills that I did not naturally have. So I don't think I was a born leader. I was just born with a mission, so to speak. If that makes sense. So, I'm sure we'll get later into my story, but I had this recovery story of being somebody with a overeating problem, and I overcame that, and my story changed my life. And then I have spent my entire life helping other people out of the pit that I was in. But I did always understand that the more that I could do to make a message real and to make it a stronger message out there in the world for people, that more people could find help in the Lord if I could be someone with a voice.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the short version. There's a lot of baby steps that say a lot of baby steps and a lot of shaking in my boots.
Yes.
A lot of help and a lot of support, and still a lot of steps that go into kind of being in a position that never was natural for me. So
yeah. I think a lot of our listeners will relate to that, because so many of us, it's more about the mission God has given us and, the message that he has given us to share and to impact people with. And it's not necessarily that we felt like we were, like you said, born as a leader, and so God has to do a lot of work on us to grow and to stretch and to take us out of that comfort zone so that we can effectively share the message. So I love that you shared that's been your journey. So Dr. Rhona, you are a licensed psychologist and an addiction counselor, and you have been practicing in that field for a long time. And one of the reasons we wanted to talk with you is because you really work with people, like you've shared, about overcoming food issues and having freedom in our lives, especially as Christians. But you have shared a little bit that you have your own journey. So would you be willing to share with us kind of your journey of struggling with food and how you have gotten to the place of being free from that?
Yes, for me, it was a big deal. I could talk for hours about the story, but I won't bore you with all the details. But I, was a kid who was preoccupied with food, and it was one of these progressive problems that went from sort of a kid that loved sweets and was hiding and sneaking and sort of wanting more than normal, to kind of getting a little bit of a weight issue, to starting dieting in my early, preteen years, and feeling a little awkward with my weight. But then, I'm going fast because I don't want to take the time talking all about this. But from 12 to 17, it was like a spiral in total insanity and full-blown disordered eating and obsession and binging on large amounts of, half gallons of ice cream, boxes of double stuffed Oreos, boxes of Pop-Tarts, boxes of Captain Crunch, all sugar. I only eat sugar and pasta. It's all I ate, just junk. I just lived on it, and it was bad. It was really, I always say, I kind of was like a heroin addict with sugar, and the way it got, it was just got worse and worse. And then, the weight started creeping on, and I was trying to control it, and the diets and the starvation, and then binges, to the point where by the time I was in my senior year of high school, I was so messed up. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't concentrate. I felt ashamed of myself. I couldn't control, the diets weren't working at all. I was completely lying. I would pretend I was on a diet to myself even, I'm going to be on this diet. But then I couldn't do the diet that I was pretending to myself that I was on. I was on it only till 3:00 in the afternoon. And then by 3:00, I was binging again, and then wanting to kill myself because I was growing and just felt like there was no hope, and I didn't have any hope. And then, ended up getting help. At 17, I started getting help. And the help that I got landed me in a new relationship with God. So it was actually a salvation experience and a transformation that was deep. And it was so much more than a diet. I had to learn some things. I learned that I was addicted to sugar, that it was like heroin for me. I learned that I had emotional problems that I was eating over, and I was using food as a drug. And I needed to learn how to find other coping strategies. And I had to do a lot of therapy, and I needed a lot of support. And it was a big deal to get over, not like a little deal. It was a big deal. But I've been free for 38 years. I haven't walked in, I don't struggle, I don't have temptation, and God set me free. But it wasn't like an overnight thing, but it's a total free thing. So that's the story. So.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that's difficult to share, but so helpful to so many people. So you take a holistic approach in your work addressing food issues, bringing together mind, body, and spirit. So what are some of the underlying issues that can lead to food addictions and disorders? And why do you think it's so vital for Christian women to deal with the root issues rather than just the symptoms?
Well, if you just try to deal with the symptoms, it generally doesn't work. I mean, if a person's problem is just that they need to lose a little weight, then a diet will work. I mean, people who don't have a real problem can go on a diet and fix their weight problem. And then it's over. But people who are in battles where the food is constantly calling their name and they say they're going to fix it, but then they don't, and they keep swearing it off, and then they're back into trouble. And then, it's bondage. The underlying issues are, my first book is Food Triggers, and some will say it's a hard read because it goes through all the underlying issues. And when you start looking at it, there's so many pieces and parts. And if a person's really willing to look, they'll start realizing all the reasons that they're eating. And somebody like myself who would never understand, like most people don't start using drugs till they're teenagers, but people start using food when they're like little. So if food is comfort for when you're sad, and food shuts down anger, and food is being used to get you quiet and entertain you when you're bored, and you have learned to pair food with all sorts of emotions from the time you're really teeny, and that's just what you do. And then what happens for us is that instead of thinking, I feel sad, angry, frustrated, you just think, I want food. And the feelings aren't even there. It's just, I want to eat. And food starts calling, and the feelings they're absent. And people just think, oh, well, I like food, I want food. So you have to learn all the underlying, until the person actually makes a break from using food all day long in the wrong ways. If you're willing, then you'll start realizing why you want food. And that's like a lesson that we have to learn, because it's 1,000 different reasons. Some of it is because the food itself is addictive. And most of us don't really believe that or understand that. But there's people who are making foods on purpose so that we won't be able to stop eating them. And so there's chemical properties to the foods, the high processed foods, the high fat, high sugar foods that we're eating, that people are selling on the shelves, and we're like, they're decadent and delicious and they're inviting, and we put them out and we give them to our kids and we celebrate with them. And for some people, that's fine. They'll eat them in moderation. But for some of us, our brains are made in a different way. So where we eat them, we can't stop. It's just like one person can drink a glass of wine and be done. Another person becomes an alcoholic. So if you don't understand that you're a vulnerable person in that regard, you won't understand that sugar is a drug for you because you have a vulnerability to it. So the underlying issues are physical and emotional. That makes sense. And spiritual. We could go on. I can keep talking. Get me going. I'll keep going.
I think it's helpful. Like everything you're sharing is super helpful. And this is something we really haven't addressed on this podcast in almost 3 years of doing the podcast. And I think it's really an important topic for us in the church and, as Christian leaders to be talking about. So I appreciate you sharing these different, the underlying triggers or challenges. And like you said, even just discerning for each person, it may be different. This isn't like a, cut and dry formula of like, if this is happening, then this is the issue, right? It's very, very nuanced and different.
Right.
And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about is we all need food to live, right? We all need food to survive. And for some of us, we may just think, oh, I just have like this bad habit, or I just have this tendency to gravitate towards certain foods. But then there's times, like you said, that it may actually be a food obsession or an addiction or even a disorder. So could you help us maybe figure out or how to discern, maybe just even for ourselves, when something crosses a line to an obsession or an addiction or a disorder versus perhaps it's just a bad habit or some other thing that we need to deal with?
I think if something has you around the neck and, it's destroying your life, like in my case, it was destroying my life. I couldn't even see straight after a while. I mean, it was just, I have clients who come in and they're so given to their food problem that they're not managing their families. They're not managing their work lives. I mean, it's just, the shame is so intense. Like I have people stuck on sofas. They can't walk or move. I mean, so when it's ruining your life, there's something seriously wrong. When the doctor tells you have diabetes or heart disease or some other serious problem, or I've had clients who have had weight loss surgeries and they've blown right through. They lost 100 pounds and gained it back. And now they're sick. And they know if they overeat, they're going to be sick, but they eat anyway. And then they make themselves get really sick, but they can't stop eating. That's an addiction, right? It's so dysfunctional. It's so out of control. But there's so many, like one of my best friends, she always says, I had an inordinate desire for chocolate chip cookie. For her, it was like more of a bad habit than an addiction, but it's something that she would need to pull back from because spiritually, as a woman of God, she didn't like the way those cookies called her because she was just being honest in her relationship with God. She felt like she was hooked on those, even if it was only one big chocolate chip cookie that was calling her. It wasn't like boxes and it wasn't ruining her life, but she didn't like the way it had her. Like she had to have it. And the way it called her name, so she was being seduced by it, and something just inside of her spirit didn't feel right about it. And so just wanting to be right with God, she would just part from it during these times when she felt like it was creating, like she said, an inordinate affection. Sometimes a normal person who's not an addict can take a period of maybe a break from something and then try to go back to having it in moderation. And if they can do it in moderation, they may not have an addiction. But an addict can't do it in moderation. Somebody who's an addict can never do it in moderation. They'll always end up back into the binges and back into the crazy. So, like another example, I had a woman, she had no history of overeating her whole life. She was a pastor's wife. They had a baby and her husband was out doing ministry and she's home with the baby. And during the baby's naps, she found herself overeating. And then she came in and she was worried. All of a sudden, she has an eating disorder, she thinks. But we started realizing she was just bored. And she just started snacking because she was bored. So we start talking about it, and I'm looking at her. She has none of the symptoms of being a person who's, it wasn't in her family. She didn't have a childhood history. It was one of these things where this just started happening after the baby and during these periods of being all alone at home with the sleeping baby. And she's sitting there like, no, I don't know what to do with myself. And she started doing some crafts or different fun things like during the nap time, and it ended. Like, I've seen this with other people at work where they hate their job and then they realize there's some candy machine and that's like getting them through the boring job. When we start realizing that's not the same as an eating disorder, because if we can find an alternative way of relating to the problem, then maybe we fix the problem that way. But if you can't fix the problem and the food just gets worse and worse and worse, then maybe we have to treat the eating disorder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I do have a question about this, though. Like when you're talking about sort of addiction or food disorders, for someone else who's an addict, whether it be alcohol or drugs, they can work on those sort of heart issues, mind body issues. But a lot of the addiction recovery comes from just abstaining, just not ever doing it again. But with food, we can't do that. You have to eat every day, right? So how does someone who is addicted to food or disorder or food obsession, wherever that lies, how does someone actually find freedom when they can't ever completely give this thing up in comparison to another type of addiction?
So if a person's identified themselves as having a food addiction, then we're going to look at it in a totally different way than a normal person with a habit. Okay. And so then we start to discern the difference between foods that are healthy, nourishing, and fine, and like totally clean eating foods, and foods that are drug foods and alcoholic foods. What happens when a person's put themselves on a recovery path is they begin to understand that we absolutely do not have to eat the foods that we're addicted to. They are not the same. Most people are not binging on broccoli and chicken and salmon and green beans and brown rice and sweet potatoes. Those are not the things we're binging on. We're binging on cookies and ice cream and pizza and things that are really, all the processed junk food. Most of it's not even real food. Like it's not really, if you actually look at the boxes and the ingredients, it's mostly chemicals, not really food. So what a person in food recovery needs to do is they need to make, with the help of support, make a food plan and have a clarity and lines so that there's an understanding. Here's what I eat. And some of it is sort of making up your mind, like I eat, because there's multiple things. There's food, and then there's volume, because a person can be eating all day. Some people binge, some people just snack all day. That's sort of a grazer. It comes in different ways. So usually people in food recovery go on food plans where they have a very clear, healthy, hearty, not diety, very sustainable food plan, something you can live on for the rest of your life, not hurry up and lose weight type of a food plan. Something that's really satisfying. Every client that I know who's gotten onto these food plans, they're like, I love my food plan because it's satisfying. It's healthy. It's good. It makes you feel like every meal really counts. You don't feel deprived. You really get what you need in your meals. It's not like dieting where they take away everything and then you feel like you just can't wait to your next meal because you're starving to death. You have to feel like your meals count because that's all you're going to eat. There's no snacking on whatever you feel like in the cupboards afterwards, So the only foods you eat are the healthy, nourishing foods. So your body is really getting what it needs and you get full. And so there's none of this like I'm making up for my yesterday's binge by starving today, or I'm going to not eat now because I'm going to binge later. It's like eating regular, like 3 meals. And if I'm having a snack, it's the planned snack that's whole, healthy, hearty. And then you really have a separation. What's the difference between my food plan that I've made an agreement and a thought through that has everything that I need in it, so I'm nourished, and an addictive eating? They're 2 separate things. So this way your life and your food don't mix. And this way, when you're emotional, you're not using food for your emotions, because you're only eating what you planned. And so if you're sad, then you're sad. You're not eating till dinner. If you're angry, you're still not only eating till dinner. Like your food and your feelings are separated by your plan. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So I love how you have been sharing, about some of the emotional side of how we might be having to deal with the food obsessions or addictions, as well as more of the practical, making the food plan and that kind of thing. But, many of our listeners, most of our listeners are Christians, and they may be in a place where they feel like they're struggling with this. And maybe they've prayed before, they've asked God to remove their food addiction or remove remove the challenge that they're having with food. But he doesn't always do that, right? It's not always an overnight thing, like you said. So I would love to talk about, how do you feel faith plays a role in this journey of overcoming food addictions or eating disorders?
I think faith is the biggest part in some ways. I mean, obviously, I think you're right. And I love what you said about people do pray and they feel so discouraged, because it's such a challenge to ask God and then feel like, where are you? And why are you letting me stay in this battle? And I think for a lot of people, this is just a horrible area of hopelessness and like just bondage. People feeling like they're trying and they're getting nowhere and everything they try is just failing. And I think the discouragement is so great. It can really, really mess with a person's spirituality. Even people just walking around in shame, feeling like they're not right before God. They know they're sort of out of God's will, and they don't know how to connect with God around this. And then two, I think the other thing that I see is people who don't even consider God, like in a sense of understanding that God wants to help us. I mean, he cares about us so much. He knows every hair on our head. Like, he cares about our relationship with food. And if we're in bondage, he cares. But like, I hear some people saying things like, well, why does he care about me and my little food problem? And people have a tendency to think like, this shouldn't be a problem. It's just food. And they tend to kind of feel like, why is this a problem? Why can't I just get on with it? And so people really do tend to feel like it shouldn't be the deal that it is. And then because of that, they just stay away from God around this. And they don't understand how much they really need God. And what I see is, I work with mostly believers. And I think that this problem, when people are struggling all day, this is a 24/7 problem. I mean, this is not one of those things that goes away so easy. I mean, the food thoughts and the food struggle goes on all day in a person's life. From the time they get up in the morning, and the shaming body image thoughts, and the struggles with what to eat and what not to eat, and how am I going to do this, and then trying to do okay. And it's a battle all day. So I think, in a sense, when a person finally understands the level of dependence that we really need to have on him around this, that actually it's a wonderful thing when you come to realize some things go away by a simple prayer. Many of us have had that in our salvation and our walks with God. We've had God remove a problem in a prayer, in a moment. We've had a miracle. And then some things are like more of those things that really teach us about dependence and really being close to God in a way that maybe we didn't like to have to learn. But this teaches us about his power in our weakness in ways that it's really supernatural when you come to realize, I need him so much, I can't do it even for an hour without him. That's like the real humility of understanding it. Like, I am really, truly, totally unable. I cannot do this. I mean, when people need to kind of get that, and then also realize, not just do I need God to help me all day, because yes, food can be that challenging, but also I need help from my sisters and brothers in the Lord, because I can't do it.
Yeah, I love that you shared that. I think definitely when you talk about shame, especially when you're talking addiction or sin, a lot of times we're afraid to, we just want to go to God and just want to talk to him and just want him to fix it so that we don't have to share it with anyone else. And when we do, oftentimes there's so much freedom, and it's one of those things that just helps the healing process so much more. But because of the shame and because of those things, we just want to be able to just, say a little prayer, have God's magic wand come down and tap us on the head, and then we're good. And I truly don't think that that's how he set this up. We need each other. I mean, we need him ultimately, but we need each other as well. So I love that you talked about that. Mm-hmm. So your book, Satisfied, and the Satisfied Workbook offers spiritual guidance and psychological insight, along with the traditional 12 steps of addiction recovery. So I'm wondering what you kind of say to those who question the reality of a food addiction, that it's not something real, that they just minimize it. And then kind of a second part to this question is, how does that recovery model actually assist with overcoming food issues? So I know those are two kind of different questions, but if you can kind of address them both, that would be great.
Lots of people don't believe in food addiction as a real thing. So it's a very good question. And, in the eating disorders world, it's a huge controversy. And basically, the addictions model has not been accepted in the eating disorders world. But what you see, though, in the church basements all over the world and on Zoom meetings, thousands and thousands of people in 12-step groups all over the world getting free. But the eating disorders community won't see it. So, but if you were to go to 12-step groups and you hear people saying, once I understood that I have an addiction, it changed my life, it changed everything for me. And that's real live people's experiences. I understand, I think the eating disorders people are coming from, I believe, this is my belief, personal belief, that if you look at eating disorders treatment and where it came from, anorexia, with anorexia, which is starvation, people are afraid of food. They're afraid that food is fattening. They're afraid that food, is bad. And they get into this obsession about calories and fat grams and all this other stuff. And bulimia can have that as well, because bulimia has the two sides, the binging and the starving and the dieting. And so you have the two sides. And people who are compulsive eaters and food addicts can have a lot of those tendencies as well. But food addiction is another problem. And some people with anorexia and bulimia have food addictions too. My problem with the way that people are thinking of it, rather than seeing these as different treatment models for different problems, which is how I see it, like they're just throwing out this idea altogether, because they are thinking if you call food bad, so if I say it's addictive, they say it's bad. So if I say sugar is bad, I say it's addictive, they say, oh, well, you can't, if you tell a person to be off of sugar, that means you're calling it a bad food. And we don't believe in any bad foods, because we want the anorexic to be comfortable with all foods, because we don't want them to be afraid of food, which is a totally understandable thing. But somebody who's obsessed with diets, with calories and fat grams, needs to get comfortable eating, and they need to not be afraid of calories and fat. But a person who's binging on thousands of calories of ice cream and cookies and has been in treatment 10 times for bulimia and compulsive overeating, and no one's ever said to them, stop eating sugar, maybe you're addicted to it. No one ever will say that, because they won't ever admit that that might be a possibility, even though there's research, brain research, that says that sugar is 8 times more addictive than cocaine. And when I do family histories, what I see with the people who I work with who are self-identified food addicts, and I think people know themselves. When I see a person and I'm doing their history, they know when they've tried everything and they've done it all. And they're like, I know I can't eat a cookie in moderation. I know, because I've done the test and I failed the test, and I know that I can't eat them in moderation. I've never been able to do it. So I think the thing is like trying to understand for yourself, whether the world accepts it or not. I mean, I've been off sugar for 38 years and I have peace. I don't want to eat sugar if it's going to ruin my life and make me crazy and not be able to think straight, and reawaken an obsession and an insanity that almost destroyed my life. I'm very comfortable not eating it if I have a choice between peace and insanity. And so I understand for myself that if I look at my family, I see people with food battles all over my mother's side of the family. If that's not a genetic thing, I mean, I do family histories with my clients. It's always in the family. So is that a sign? I mean, alcoholism's often in the family. Is that a sign? Yes. I mean, I think there's enough science and enough history that I don't have to question or wonder whether or not there's possibly an addictiveness about it. But the real test is when a person gets abstinent, Are they free? Does the temptations go away? Do the cravings stop? When the person has peace now and they're not in a fight anymore, why do you need to keep on tempting yourself with it if getting off of it works? So it's like anything, like a person is depressed and they go on antidepressant 1, antidepressant 2, antidepressant 3, and antidepressant 3 works, then that's the medicine for them. If a person's having disordered eating and they go to treatment that's emotionally based and they try to do mindfulness eating and they try to do this kind of eating and that kind of eating and nothing works and they've done 10 treatments and now we say, let's try food addiction treatment. And if you get off the sugar and try a 12-step model and that works, why are we questioning it? It's another model that is for people who need that. That's how I see this. And so, it's not for everybody. It's for the people who know that's what they need.
Yeah.
So
I love that you've just shared that, because I think for a lot of us, and even myself, I didn't realize that there were these different schools of thought when it comes to these issues. So I think that's really helpful, first of all, just to be aware of these issues. And I'm curious, I guess what I have heard before, because I have a background in social work, so I've studied a little bit, like a tiny bit of the issue of anorexia and bulimia. And I've heard a lot of that being related to issues really around anxiety, as well as often I hear a lot about, control issues. And so I'm curious, do you think that's why that community maybe doesn't like the idea of the abstinence model? Because it's almost like feeding the anxiety or feeding the control issue that maybe that person might have if they struggle with that issue?
It could. I mean, and I totally understand that. It's just, it makes sense. And I think for a person, if a mindfulness approach can work for a person, then they should do that. If they can learn to eat cookies and cake in moderation, they should do that. I would never recommend abstinence to a person who can do it any other way. Abstinence is for people who have failed all the tests 100 times. And then they're like, okay, I get it. Now I'm going to try that. But the thing that's different about this is that it's God in control. I mean, it's giving God control. In a sense, it's surrendering a substance like heroin or alcohol. That's the thing that's so strange and weird about this. We don't ever question it when it comes to alcohol or heroin. We would never tell an alcoholic to drink in moderation. That's not a question. If you had a friend who was formerly a cocaine addict, you would not tell them to have a hit. And yet, we insist that people should have to have some sugar, because how could you possibly be addicted to sugar? And it's just, and our people will stay in bondage because we won't have it. And so it's a very challenging issue.
That's a very eye-opening way to put it. Like, you're absolutely right. Like, you would never say to an alcoholic, well, just have a small glass of wine with me. That would be horrendous to do. And so I love that you've sort of made that connection for us. So many of our listeners are leaders in their workplace, church, or community, and many are also moms. And for those who love someone who may have an unhealthy relationship with food, how can they help? What should they do? What's the best way to approach something like that?
So, I mean, it depends, I guess. Did the person ask for help? If the person's asking for help, or are you suspecting the person needs help? Because that's two different.
I think that's a good line to kind of talk about, whether you think they need it or they think they need it. So that would be a great thing for you to discuss too.
Because it's really hard if you think they need it, but they don't think they need it, or they're not bringing it up. I mean, that's a really challenging issue, because it can really hurt somebody's feelings if you impose some sort of suggestion or idea on a person. I think one of the beautiful things about recovery groups is that people share their own stories with each other, and they help each other through, that's how AA was built, one person sharing their recovery with another. And, the honesty of like, yes, I've been there. And then another person says, yeah, me too. And then there's something about the Me Too thing that just makes a person feel free to let themselves be helped, because they know they're understood. I think that's sometimes why people will come to me, because I've been publicly honest that I understand. I've been there. I know what it's like to be out of control. And I think people feel secure, like they understand that I understand. So I always think that that's like a better place to come from. There's nothing more hurtful for a person than to feel like they're being judged about their weight. And that's not really the issue. The weight is a consequence of, a much more complicated problem. But people get obsessed about weight, and that's just not the problem. Weight is what we feel sad about, and weight is what makes us upset. And it's what we get jammed up about, but it's really not the problem. The problem is our relationship with food. So if we talk about that, if we could get there, and most of us can talk about that, because actually even most people have some sort of thing. And so I think it's just being real and being honest, recommending a book, recommending listening to a podcast. If a person's open, I have a Facebook group that, people can listen in on. If somebody wants help, there's help. There's a Christian online group called Full of Faith. That's a 12-step group that's Christian that people can access. There's Overeaters Anonymous. There's other 12-step groups that are available. And so if a person I have 3 books. They're super helpful: Food Triggers and Satisfied. And I think offering groups in church, recommending that people do it together, even in a discipleship sort of way. And actually, honestly, many people have said this to me, that they have found that my books, even though they were written for food, they actually apply to every other issue in the world, like anything. So if somebody's come to you and said, like, hey, I have this issue, let's say somebody's in discipleship together or mentoring, and they want help and they want to work together with you, like going through the 90-day Satisfied devotional is a way, like something you could do together. It's simple, but it also could be like a really enriching spiritual journey that you could do in partnership with another person. And the same thing with the 12-step workbook. These are tools that you could use in partnership with somebody who needs help.
Yeah, I love that. I think that those are lots of really good resources. And I think that just having a wealth of different things to, I don't want to say try, but find what works for you, just like you talked about those different models, is really good. I'd love to get your opinion on something. There is a very big push the past few years, specifically in social media, for body positivity, size inclusion, all of those types of things. And for the most part, that's seen as positive. But there are those people, and oftentimes this comes from sort of the trainers maybe, or nutritionists or whatever, saying this is not healthy. You can't be this size and be healthy. So I would love to know your opinion on the body positivity, size inclusion movement. Is it healthy? Is it not healthy? And kind of where should a Christian live in this space of having an opinion or trying to figure out their convictions when it comes to this?
I always think it's important to love your body. So I don't care what size you are. That's like a really actually like baby beginning place to start. Like if you're too thin or too heavy or whatever, wherever you are, you should love yourself. I think that body positivity is important, because shame and body hatred is a reason to eat, actually. And it's one of the main reasons that people binge. People get on the scale and then they binge because of the numbers on the scale. There's people look at their bodies and they don't like what they see. And that actually leads to self-destructive behavior. So I definitely think no matter where you are on the scale, no matter what size you are, find a way to override all negative body talk. And that's a job, because people all sizes go through body hatred. So I'm all for loving your body and finding a way to do that. I always say neutralizing negative body talk. It's a really, really important thing to change your mindset. I guess the thing what I don't know how to respond about, because I know some people who I work with who have a history of obesity and have worked on themselves and are trying to eat healthy, but because of the years of dieting and yo-yo dieting and whatnot, their weight's not coming off, even though they're eating healthy. And I really think that it's not really fair to look at it from a weight perspective, because it's not about what size you are. But I do think it's totally unhealthy to eat unhealthy food. So if we're trashing our bodies, doesn't matter what size you are. If you're 115 pounds and you are living on McDonald's, that's horrible. And if you're 300 pounds and you're living on McDonald's, that's horrible. So you should love your body, whatever size you are, and you should eat right, because your body wasn't made for junk food. The body was not made to eat processed food, high fat and high sugar food. The body was not made for that. And I think from a health perspective, it's not self-care and self-love to trash our bodies. It's unquestionable. And Mark Hyman is a functional medicine doctor, and he says, if you eat crap, you feel like crap. And the bottom line is, like, if you understand metabolic syndrome, which is what happens when the body eats the wrong food, our body gets sick. Being overweight is just one of the ways that the body says, you've done something to me that wasn't right. But it also, like, you could be a normal weight and have diabetes because you're not eating the right foods. Because if you eat, all you eat is sugar and white flour, you're going to have problems, so you can maintain your weight by doing all kinds of other things and still be just really off. And I think it's God's will to love your body by taking care of it. And I don't think we should be making ourselves sick. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the answer to the question.
No, I appreciate your answer. I think that was good and really a good way to frame it, honestly. So yeah, thank you.
All right. So Holly threw you a tough one. So I got one more tough one, and then we'll wrap it up. And because what I'm thinking about with this, and even what I said before, is that we haven't even had this topic on our podcast in almost 3 years. And I think about the fact that I have grown up in church. I have been in church as long as I can remember. And I can remember approximately 0 sermons about food. And so I'm curious what your thought is on what the church can do, because it seems like maybe where we've gone off track, at least as Christian women, is that this just isn't being talked about in church or in relation to our spiritual lives. And so what can the church do differently? Are there any kind of practical things that we could start doing, even as leaders? Some of us are leaders in our churches. What are some of the things we should be doing in the church specifically to address this issue of having freedom around the issue of food?
You are so right. I could cry. And that's why I do what I do. And that's why I speak and lead, because I know what you're saying is right. And I actually feel burdened in my heart, because I know, it's like, I borrowed this line. It's about something else, but I borrowed this line from somebody, a leader, who said this about another verse. But it's like in the scriptures, we just blink on the scripture about gluttony. It's like we just blink. We just pass it by and blink. But I know this may sound a little over spiritual, but forgive me if for those of you who, I feel like this is an area where the enemy is tearing people down and making people sick, obsessed, out of control. People are all over, women and men, but mostly women, have bondages and battles going on in secret. And it's not only from a health perspective. People don't want to go in public. They don't want to go out. They don't want to come to church because they don't want to be seen. They're embarrassed about their weight. While they're sitting there in the sermon, they're obsessing about their body, what they look like, what they're eating, what they're not eating. And while they're sitting there with a pasted smile on, and they're miserable inside, and they're sorry for what they ate the night before. And it's a miserable, horrible problem. And you're right, we are not talking about it. And let me tell you, when I speak in front of people, like large groups, it never fails. And I'm talking to leaders. Every time I finish talking, I have a line of crying people who are there, who are supposed to be learning how to help other people with this problem. And they're crying because they have a problem. And no one ever talks about it. So when I think this is just, it's like a thing, it's in the dark. And I think it's because people just feel like we shouldn't have this problem. It's just food. It shouldn't be like this. So we won't talk about it. And who are you going to tell this to? That you have a secret insanity. So, and if you're a leader, you're not supposed to have any problems anyway, right? Because you're supposed to be the one helping everybody else. So that's like, and then people can come to me because I'm a counselor and the doors are closed and no one knows. But you tell your friend that you have a secret binging thing going on in the dark, that's a really challenging subject. So, yeah, I think one of the best things that can happen is for people to offer to do small groups. Like if there's a care ministry in the church, offer for a 90-day satisfied group to go through the book, the devotional, or to go through the 12-step. These books were written so that groups can go through them together. They're all scripture-based and they're meant to go through as a group. So that would be what I would encourage, is to have people go, do it together as an offering. And you'll see if people know that that there's a safe thing going on, that's the best thing I could say. I mean, it gives people permission to come out of the woodwork.
So we believe that leaders are learners, and we know that our guests usually have really great resources to share. You've mentioned your books, the Satisfied book, the workbook, and Food Triggers. You've mentioned those, but I'm wondering if there's any other book or resource or podcast that you've been learning from recently. And it doesn't necessarily need to be on, this specific topic, anything that's been helpful to you in either your spiritual journey or leadership journey, just any knowledge that you've been soaking in. We'd love to hear what you've been enjoying recently.
Yeah, well, mostly I enjoy reading the Word of God. That's my favorite book, and it stands to always be my favorite book. So I know that may seem like a simple answer, but it is my favorite book always. So I stand firm on that. But as a leader, I have been doing something different, and this is very unlike me. Usually all the books I read are like Christian self-help books or Christian living books. It's all I don't read anything else really. But because I have my baby steps of trying to bring this message into the world and being slow about it and having challenges with my, I do work full time and do one-on-one, but I've had this long-term desire to bring what I do more into the world. And I've slowly made progress in that way, but I know I haven't made as much progress as I'd like, as I believe it's God's will to bring this message of hope and victory in Him to the world. So I have been, during the pandemic, I kind of happened upon some things that were going on about doing online education. So there's been a few leaders, one being Pete Vargas and the other Dean Grazioso. And these guys, actually, I do believe they are believers, but they've been having these sort of big, several days of talking about mindset and bringing your message out and rise up world and go out and get your message out into the world. And I've been finding that for me, getting past like, I can't do it because this, that, and the other thing, whatever it is that traps me into my spinning wheels of having too many ideas, not enough time, not knowing exactly what to do next, not feeling like I got a grasp on social media and how to get, I'm a counselor. I'm not a marketing person. I don't like doing that. And yet, if the message is going to get out, something has to change in order for that to happen. So I'm trying to get a hold of how do I get from what I do in the office to bring that transformation message into the world so that more people can be exposed to the answer. And so, really the message that I'm getting, and I'm going to share this one point that I'm getting that I know is important for all of us. It's the message. It's not me. That's what I've been soaking on to remember. If I can remember that it's the people who need the hope, that if I fail because of my tripping up on my stuff, then all the people who aren't getting help because of me questioning my abilities, so it's the message, that it's being faithful to the message. And that's what I'm kind of focusing on. So,
yeah. It's so good. Taking the focus off of ourselves and doing those scary things that feel uncomfortable, but that it's required if you're going to move forward with that. All right, Dr. Rhona, this has been really a powerful conversation. Thank you so much for what you have shared and for taking the time to talk with us. So I am sure that there are going to be some listeners who want to learn more. We'll put the links to your books and all that in our show notes. But as we close out, could you share where is the best place for people to connect with you and learn more about what you are doing?
Well, drrhona.com. I have a website. Also on Facebook, I'm more active there, Dr. Rhona Official. So my name is spelled Rhona, Dr. Rhona, Drrhona Official on Facebook. So I have a page there where there's a group too, like a little group called Overcoming Overeating. And if people want to join the group, it's free.
Perfect. We will make sure those are linked up in the show notes so people can click right through and get connected with you. So again, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your message with our audience.
Thank you for having me. It's so great to be with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.